Welcome everybody to the new Lyre podcast. I'm back again with our guest Adam Cedia. Welcome, Adam Cedia.
Good to be back.
So Adam, as we have spoken before, Adam is a poet, lawyer based out of Indiana, an essayist, and my name is David Gosselin. I'm the editor of The Chained Muse, as well as the New Lyre magazine, which will be coming out shortly, its first full edition. So we look forward to talking more about that and keeping our guests updated about that.
And congratulations on that.
Yeah, it's very exciting. So it's very exciting, in fact, because we're talking about something that, in a sense, is not popular, but in a sense goes above, the popular tastes or styles of any given age. We're talking about timeless poetry. And timeless poetry, some call it classical poetry. Some people maybe call it traditional poetry, which is a bit more misleading. And others mistakenly might refer to it as formalist poetry, which I think has a lot of problems, and we'll probably get into that. But this is actually going to be somewhat of a special and lively discussion, because we're going to be looking at poems by what I believe is one of the most impressive and one of the most timeless poets of the 20th and 21st century, named Michael Burch. Michael Burch is a poet who I think we can demonstrate this, and I think people who are knowledgeable in these kind of matters, if they've really studied poetry over the ages, will agree with me that Michael Burch really is something of our own English Goethe. He has very much the same, a very similar poetic sensibility. He's able to weave poetry out of seemingly, just a few words, almost nothing. And it always comes together. There's always a very strong sense of harmony and beauty, which comes across regardless of what his subject is or how he's treating things. He manages to always give his subject a timeless treatment, which is, I think, something that's very important today when we're talking about art, and especially if we want to be more specific, high art. What is a standard for high art? And I think just hearing that, for a lot of people, it's a bit upsetting, right? I mean, high art, that basically you're a snob, right? If you think there's something called high art, and high art is quote unquote better than quote unquote popular art, or just art generally, that there are different kinds of art, or that there's a hierarchy of some kind, or some sort of qualitative distinction, a lot of people get very upset. They get very emotional about this. So I think it's important that we really take the time to look at some examples and show how a timeless treatment in classical poetry and classical art can be achieved in any age. It's not a question of tradition in the sense of some static, status quo, or some unchanging standard, or some linguistic or formal sort of requirement. It goes beyond all that. And in fact, oftentimes something which is new and timeless may seem very different from the timeless tradition of its past, because it's by its nature doing something new as well. So
and tradition, when we talk about, I'm sorry, when we talk about tradition, there's this, I think, unjust gravitation to think about something that's dead, that's being preserved in aspect, that is not relevant. And tradition is by definition living. Tradition, again, my etymology fetish is it's from the Latin for to hand down or to turn over. Tradition is what's handed down to us, what we hold, and what we are supposed to pass on to those who come after us. So because language changes, the arts that derive from language, poetry and drama, are necessarily going to change as well. We are not going to write like Shakespeare. We would never come. Shakespeare was a product of his timeless because he is Shakespeare. And for us to admire him is one thing, to imitate him exactly would be silly.
Mm,
What our role is to build off of what he and Milton and Keats and going down the line did, and to pass this tradition of English language poetry in whatever form English is going to be 200-300 years down the road, for those who come after us.
right. Right. And yeah, sorry about that before. I had a bit of a hiccup because I remembered the thing that I had actually been thinking about earlier on in the day. And I was like, yeah, this is what I'm going to start the podcast with. And it just hit me as I was in the middle of another thought. But since, I mean, we're talking about this question of modernism a lot, the problems with modernism, the challenges, what does it mean to write a modern classical poem or a modern work of timeless art? There's a few words there and they mean a lot of things to many different people. But, you have written a piece, Adam, on Ezra Pound, which isn't out yet. And we're going to be discussing that in the future. But one of the things that I think is worth noting is that Pound had this famous injunction, make it new, right? That was the creed of the modernists in a real sense, right? It was about making things new, doing something, which, what does that mean? Number one, make it new in relationship to the past history of poetry. But, who knows what their definition of what the nature of the poetry of the past was. But the point is, he said, make it new. And so in the 20th century, and even in the 21st century, I think it's gotten way out of control. It could easily get out of control if your goal is just to create novel effects and find sort of new ways of creating literary effects, new ways of using language to sort of shock or surprise people, or taking ever more scandalous subjects or edgy subjects, pushing the envelope. That's all quote unquote making it new. But I think we need a new.
Well, making it new is also tautological. Unless you're copying what someone else did, all poetry is by definition new.
Fair,
Um,
fair enough.
yeah, what I think he really meant to say is make it not, I don't make it shocking, make it novel, something. And we're at the point now where the envelope has been pushed. You can say it's been spread so thin it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So I think this is the time, and Pound was alive at a time when none of this stuff had been tried, and I think we're at a time now where everything has been exhausted, and we need to really look back and go back to brass tacks, as they say, and figure out what makes a poem timeless.
Right. And so I would propose a new injunction. The new injunction is make it timeless. And I think that sort of situates the paradox that, in a sense, make it new, that's just half the question. That's half the challenge. Yes, your poetry, it has to be new, but it also has to be timeless. So by saying make it timeless, I'm basically just adding I'm just adding a qualifier to the first. I'm just adding a second dimension, which is that something should be, yes, it should be quote unquote new. It should be quote unquote original. It has to be. Otherwise, is it just mimicking the past, or, what is the nature of the thing if it's not new or original in some way, if there's not some kind of progress. But at the same time, it should outlast its age. Ultimately, it should be to make something timeless, right? A great poet is able to make something timeless by taking emotions and thoughts, but rendering them in a way that they become more enduring, more timeless, and speak to something on a higher level that sort of transcends the mutable world. So, I mean, I think that makes everything a lot more complicated in one sense. But once that question of timelessness and newness is resolved, once that paradox is resolved, it actually makes everything a lot more simple and a lot less confusing than I think a lot of the kind of paradoxes that we see a lot of the modernist poets like T.S. Eliot, Pound, Yeats, all these guys struggling with in different ways. And I mean struggling in terms of they're treating these questions, they're trying to create something new. They're thinking about the history of poetry, the progress of poetry, and so they're approaching it with certain assumptions about, you know, what it means to make progress in poetry, what it means to express truth in art, right? There is this whole art for art's sake, right? The avant-garde, which was really art not for the general population, whether that population had a refined taste or not. It was really for a small avant-garde clique, which could sort of appreciate it amongst themselves. But the masses, they had their own, they had popular art. And there really a gulf has arisen between what we call, you know, popular culture, popular entertainment, and, you know, what we might consider the more technically advanced forms of artistic expression, whether, you know, it's atonal music or whether it's really sort of indie cinema or all these things, which are really, you know, there's a very particular or peculiar taste that's being catered to, where a lot of people are just going to be like, I don't get it. And then the question is, well, is it their fault they don't get it? Like, is it because there's something wrong with them? Or, you know, what's the nature of the art? What's the goal? What's the purpose? So, yeah, I mean, I think I've gone on enough, but this idea of timelessness.
Yeah, that's a whole subject of a podcast in and of itself, and we haven't gotten to the poems yet.
Yeah, I completely forgot what this podcast was about. No, but the paradox of timelessness and newness, I think that's a good one to wrestle with. So we're going to leave that at that. And yeah, this podcast is about the poetry of Michael Burch. So why don't I start by reciting?
But before you start, I do want to interject. Um, Mr. Burch and I exchanged uh, polemical essays probably close to 2 years ago now,
Right.
in which he had some very choice words about me, and we engaged in a very vigorous conversation through essays. And I just wanted to say, um, my disagreement with him about poetic principles in no way diminishes my respect for him as a poet, and does not diminish my ability to appreciate and enjoy his works and recognize his talent in them.
Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who hears Michael Burch's poetry, I mean, I think they'll get the timeless question, because you could read this to anybody and anybody is going to be, I think most people are going to be moved. There's a magical quality to Burch's poetry, and that's what we're all passionate about. And I think that's what all great artists are trying to tap into in some way. And I think the more and more we have artists who are being bold and original and looking for new ways to tap into this thing called creativity, this thing that often appears like magic when we experience a great work of art. We want to investigate that, and there's no better way than to hear some of it read aloud. So I'd like to open with one of, I believe, Burch's earlier poems. It's called Will There Be Starlight? So here it goes. Will there be starlight tonight, while she gathers damask and lilac and sweet-scented heathers? And will she find flowers, or will she find thorns, guarding the petals of roses unborn? Will there be moonlight tonight, while she gathers seashells and mussels and albatross feathers? And will she find treasure, or will she find pain, at the end of this rainbow of moonlight on rain? So that's Will There Be Starlight? Personally, I love this poem. I think it's an amazing piece. It's what is its subject, right? It's very, there's something very ethereal about the piece. And
Well, not only in its atmosphere, but you'll notice each stanza is a question. It asks four questions and never makes a direct statement.
right, right. And yeah, it keeps asking more and more questions. It's like adding new degrees of unknown, right? Unknown on top of unknown on top of unknown. And we're sort of left, grappling, what is this thing? And it just sort of ends on a very magical note. And will she find treasure, or will she find pain at the end of this rainbow of moonlight on rain? We'll never know what the subject ultimately is, in a sense, because the subject is unknown, right? The real subject of this poem is the unknown.
Sure, and we have, will she find flowers or will she find thorns? And then, will she find treasure or will she find pain? It could end either way. We don't know. This is in the future. And
Right.
you could very much say this is about, the transience of the present and how we don't know what's coming ahead.
Yeah. And I mean, we don't want to overthink a poem like this too, which is part of its beauty, its simplicity, is that there's an inherently musical idea here. And the music is sort of just, I think it helps to think of great poetry like this in terms of music. I mean, music doesn't have words, but we know we can, there's such thing as, the composer is posing certain musical questions, right? There's a question answer. So I mean, we see the same thing going on here, and it's really done with a very refined poetic sensibility, which is, I think, what really sort of disarms people and gets them sort of curious about, this potential for magic, that life is full of sort of unknown and seemingly almost, magical developments. Who knows? So it's sort of just it's just appreciating that. I mean, it's appreciating the nature of poetry and the nature of creativity. I mean, if we want to think of it in the most universal sense, this feeling, I'd say this kind of sentiment in Will There Be Starlight is really the kind of sentiment that anyone experiences with great art, in terms of there's something beyond that we'll never fully comprehend. And it's sort of bringing our attention to it and making it a bit less incomprehensible. So that's poem number one. Now, poem number two is Pan. So I think this is another great one. And what we're going to see is that Michael Burch is very original. He takes a lot of different subjects, he takes a lot of different forms, and he's always able to do something magical and original. And that needs to be studied. And I think all these poems can be appreciated by, virtually everybody in the English speaking world. And they should be. So here's another one. This is Pan. Among the shadows of the groaning elms, amid the darkening oaks, we fled ourselves. Once there were paths that led to coracles, that clung to piers like loosening barnacles, where we cannot return, because we lost the pebbles and the playthings, and the moss hangs weeping gently downward. Maidens' hair who never were enchanted, and the stairs that led up to the fortress in the trees will not support our weight. But on our knees we still might fit inside those splendid hours of damsels in distress, of rustic towers, of voices of the wolves' tormented howls that died, and live in dreams, soft windy vowels. Wow. I mean, that's a great piece right there. And I think you also have a passion for Greek mythology, Adam. So maybe just explain to people who Pan was, and we'll try and.
Well, sure. Pan was he was the god of shepherds and of the wild. He was this half goat figure with the bottom, the torso and head and arms of a man, and the feet, hooves, legs, and horns of a goat. And he would roam the countryside, kind of a benevolent, jolly god would roam the countryside and
Who has,
help
I mean,
shepherds tend their flocks. Yeah.
he has all kinds of uh, interesting romantic inclinations as well, right?
There are other. We're not going to get into the more. We want to keep this rated PG, I guess.
Well, and I think, but that's the interesting thing, that when you're dealing with these kind of myths, and when you're dealing with any kind of, genuine poetic subject, it can be approached in many different ways. And so, who's Pan? Why is Mike Burch talking about Pan here? What's his purpose? What's his idea? What's he getting at?
Well, I think it's interesting that this is written in the first person plural. Um, and I think you can say that this could be either Pan speaking or someone speaking to Pan. They flee they flee to the wild and lose, that is the wilderness. This isn't, they're lost, but they're not scared. They're quite happy about this. So I think, you could say this is the narrator talking to Pan as the spirit of the wild, uh, being freed from the shackles that modern urban suburban life imposes on us.
Mm-hmm.
Or and it express, or if it's not that, it expresses a desire for that release, that freedom.
Okay, I mean, yeah, you could say again, he's treating this ancient, mythology, but he's addressing some of the kind of uh, questions found in modernism, right? That there was this whole, all of a sudden we got these giant concrete cities, we got trains, we have all these things going on, and so here's Pan. I mean, even if we just have a scene of Pan, but there's an inherent tension because we also are naturally holding in our mind also the understanding that we're not in just a world of woods and fairy tales. So there's this inherent tension between this kind of rustic beauty and what we're living in, and how do we find poetry in it. And I think, I mean, there's a poem by Robert Frost. Why don't we pull this up? We're gonna read this. There's a poem by Robert Frost called Pan. Why don't we compare how the two treat the same theme? I think it'll be interesting. So let's see here. I'm pulling it up. Pan. There we go. And then we'll have you, Mr. Sedia, comment. So this is Pan with us. Pan came out of the woods one day. His skin and his hair and his eyes were gray. The gray of the moss of walls were they, and stood in the sun, and looked his fill at wooded valley and wooded hill. He stood in the zephyr, pipes in hand, on a height of naked pasture land, and all the country he did command. He saw no smoke, and he saw no roof. That was well, and he stamped a hoof. He heard he heart knew peace, for none came here to this lean feeding, save once a year, someone to salt the half-wild steer, or homespun children with clicking pails, who see so little they tell no tales. He tossed his pipes, too hard to teach a new world song, far out of reach for a sylvan sign, that the blue jays screech, and the whimper of hawks beside the sun were music enough for him. For one, times were changed from what they were. Such pipes kept less of power to stir the fruited bough of the juniper, and the fragile bluets clustered there, than the merest aimless breath of air. They were pipes of pagan mirth, and the world had found new terms of worth. He laid him down on the sun-burned earth, and ravelled a flower, and looked away. Play? Play? What should he play? And that's Pan with Us by Robert Frost. So I mean, I can't help but see some parallels, and I think Burch's treatment is rather impressive, even when compared to Frost's. There's really language. His use of Burch's use of language is quite. I mean, it's quite flawless. It's
Well, what strikes me too about this is the very original. It's very subtle. Every couplet begins and ends with an ellipsis. So there's this sense of a series of snapshots of a wider range of action that we don't necessarily see the whole continuum. We have these ellipses, you know, things are being left out, or there's like a lacuna in the action, and that I think is really intriguing too.
Well, you know what I think the great irony of this poem is, if you think about it, because he's saying, this is the turn, right? I mean, it might help, right? I mean, it's never easy to discuss recitation of a poem, and people have to have the text and all. But he lays out, right, among the shadows of the groaning elms, amid the darkening oaks, we fled ourselves. Once there were paths that led to coracles that clung to piers like loosening barnacles. Where we cannot return, there's a turn right there, because we lost the pebbles and the playthings, and the moss hangs weeping gently downward, maidens' hair who never were enchanted, and the stairs that led up to the fortress in the trees will not support our weight. There's a turn right there, there's a tension. But on our knees, we still might fit inside those splendid hours of damsels in distress, of rustic towers, of voices of the wolves' tormented howls that died, and live in dreams, soft windy vowels. I think when somebody has to think about how one actually has to recite this poem, that's when it all makes sense, right? Will not support our weight, but on our knees. So all of a sudden, it's like we recognize we can't tap into the same kind of spirit, right? This mythological or this pure, pristine spirit of nature, which Pan represents. But it's in that yearning for precisely that kind of pure spirit that the yearning itself becomes the impetus for new poetry. But on our knees, we still might fit inside those splendid hours of damsels in distress, of rustic towers. We long for those things.
Yeah, this it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We have the wilderness, we have, but we cannot return, and then but on our knees is the synthesis, the compromise position that leads to the catharsis.
Right. And I mean, as we're talking about all this, I can hear myself sort of chiming in and being like, I mean, you're killing the magic by breaking these poems down. And I think there's something to be said about that, but it's a twofold paradox, because the reality is that there is this underlying structure, right? In order to be able to recite a piece of poetry like this, one has to have a sense of the thematic development and the twists and turns. They're there. They're not just they're not abstract concepts that have no bearing on how this poem works. They're actually inherent principles in that if one really wants to bring out the poetry, one sort of has to home in on these paradoxes, on these twists and turns, because that's how we're creating the tension. There's an inherent tension in this poem, and that tension needs to be made clear. That's when the poetry shines through 100%. That's when the light really shines through. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to look at a poem. So I'd say for our listeners, I would throw out the challenge. I mean, people will probably go and look up some of Michael Burch's poetry, and we're going to link to some of it. Try and memorize and recite one of Michael Burch's poems, and recite it to yourself at first, learn it, and then recite it to somebody else, and see if you can invoke something in that other person, if you can really make these paradoxes and these delicious ironies that Matt Burch is presenting here. See if you can make those palpable.
And I would just I'll disagree with you a little bit here.
Sure.
The revelation of the structure in the poem, I think, doesn't detract from its magic. I think it enhances its beauty, and that goes into what is a classical poem. I mean, here we have the structure intimately tied with the underlying ideas of the poem. And that's where I think, you know, what is classicism in poetry comes to. It's ultimately a disciplined approach where you have this relationship between structure and subject and aesthetics that is very intentional, yet at the same time, if done well, produces absolute beauty.
Right, right. And let's take another example, because I mean, we can see how this manifests itself in endless, infinite possibilities. And yet, what's consistent is the quality of treatment. Mr. Burch's ability to really develop his themes poetically. And, you know, what does that mean? Well, let's keep reading. So this one's called Regret. These are 1, 2, 3. These are 6 stanzas, and there's not much more than 5, 6 words in each stanza. So it's very tiny. It's a very small poem, and yet when you recite this one, it's sort of just, you know, it opens it right up. So this one's called Regret. Regret, a bitter ache to bear. Once starlight languished in your hair, a shining there, as brief as rare. Regret, a pain I chose to bear. Unleash the torrent of your hair, and show me once again how rare. Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, there's barely any words here. There's less than you know, there's less than 50 words here, and I feel this is one of my favorite, just because of the way it unfolds. I mean, regret, a bitter ache to bear. Okay, there's a regret. There's a problem there. The speaker's he's sharing something with us. Once starlight languished in your hair, a shining there, as brief as rare. Regret, a pain I chose to bear. Unleash the torrent of your hair, and show me once again how rare. There's the great irony here that I see. He's choosing to remember the regret, right? A regret, a pain I chose to bear. Usually we want to forget about our bad decisions. I mean, I don't know if that's just me, but usually we learn from them. But I think we want to forget our bad decisions, or that seems to be, and this is the beauty, in fact, of this poem, that really all the beauty of it is coming from the fact that he wants to be reminded of his regret or mistake, or who knows exactly what. We don't have all the details. We don't need to know. Really, the only detail he gives us, which is what I think gives it part of its allure, is hair, the torrent of your hair. When starlight languished in your hair, as brief as rare. Such rich vowels, number one. I mean, if this was a singing class, right, we'd really be homing in on being able to speak every one of these vowels, to sing, to make all these vowels clear. But yeah, it's just hair, right? That all he has is this sort of faint image of hair and starlight, and yet we're totally enraptured by it. It's It's very fascinating. It's very poetical. What do you think about this one?
Well, there's that old cliche, less is more, but I think you can really see that in play here. It almost reminds me of, a haiku, which writing a good haiku is very hard to do, because you have to so much meaning into so little space. But this has the added dimension of musicality and rhyme. I think there's so much at work here with so little material.
Right.
It really is a well-crafted piece in that sense.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems to break the rules, the quote unquote rules of, I think somebody who's coming from a more formalist standpoint. There's always talk about formalism in the poetry world. When we start to talk about the different schools, there's modernism, there's formalism, which is a particular kind of modernism, I guess you could say. I'm not even sure. I mean, I feel like people might have various takes on that. Classical, contemporary, postmodern. But here, this seems to violate the principles of a formalist poem or even a traditional poem, in that the first line of the first stanza is just one word, regret, right? It's two syllables. A bitter ache to bear. So the next two lines each have three syllables. And I mean, if you go down again to the one, two, three, the fourth stanza, regret, two syllables, a pain, two syllables, I chose to bear, four syllables. And the third stanza, a shining there, as brief as rare, four syllables, as brief, two syllables, as rare, two syllables. So it plays around, right? It has a real playfulness in the form. It's not a distinct, it's not a metrically perfect poem, but I think that's part of its magic, because it's really just going with the musicality, and sort of the poetry's riding on the imagery, and yeah, there's just really an economy to it that's it's quite stunning. I mean, a line with two syllables, come on.
Well, there's more structure to it than it appears at first. I mean, if you take each stanza is uh, four iambs. It's iambic tetrameter, so to speak, but
Mm,
it's subdivided into lines.
right,
So that it's consistent in its between the stanzas rather than between the verses, and
right,
that's what maintains its musicality.
right.
I did write an essay on this, for the Society of Classical Poets, actually.
Yes, the
You know,
spice
the
of
the
life.
the rules are not there to be slaves to. The rules are there to aid the the musical aspects of it. That you speak in natural language, and the rules are a lot more complicated because there's a lot of exceptions. There's pyrrhic substitution, trochaic substitution, the feminine ending. All of they have technical names applied to them, but they're really just um, exceptions to allow for the verse to accommodate natural language, which is its ultimate end. And we see Burch doing that here.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a beautiful piece. I'm going to read it one more time and then we're going to skip to the next piece. I had to think about how to read this at first because it's not obvious, but it's once one actually tries it, that's where you kind of find the flow and the structure of the idea, the counterpoint. There's a real counterpoint here. There's an initial statement, regret, a bitter ache to bear. Once starlight languished in your hair, a shining there, as brief as rare. Regret, a pain I chose to bear. Unleash the torrent of your hair and show me once again how rare. The vowels there, sort of everything is just carried on. I mean, people need to hear this. people need to read great poetry aloud. It really opens the thing up. I mean, it's like an ice cube for a good glass of whiskey, or you have to decant your wine. If you're buying store-bought wine, it has to breathe a bit. You got to open it up. So I feel like it's the same thing with these poems. With a great poem like this, you gotta know what you're doing to a certain extent. I mean, if we're really gonna open it up, there's so much going on, and I think the point about Mike Burch is that it's so effortless. Um, I think the thing about Burch is that he probably doesn't even really he for sure he's thinking about form and all that, but there's an appearance of raw talent, which I think is a thing, and I think he uses his talent very beautifully. That's what's really guiding him, right? He just has this internal sense of beauty and drama, and he's just sort of finding a way to make it just right.
I have read your correspondence with him, and I agree. I was going to say, oh, I wouldn't be so sure how effortless this is. Sometimes it's the shorter poems that take the most effort. But having read what he himself says, and how he's never scanned a poem, I tend to agree with you there.
Right. I mean, still learn the rules, kids. Like, that's not what we're saying.
Is that your fresca in the background?
Exactly. So here is a new one. I Pray Tonight. It's another short one. So I think it's nice to have a couple of these short ones and just sort of have them one follow after the other. So this one's called I Pray Tonight. I pray tonight the starry light might surround you. I pray each day that come what may, no dark thing confound you. I pray ere tomorrow an end to your sorrow. May angels white chorals sing and astound you. This one is very prayerful. I pray tonight. I mean, it goes without saying, but this has a very prayerful, beautiful quality to it. I remember you said before we started recording that you really like this one. Why do you like this one, Adam?
Again, there's that ethereal quality to it, and at the same time, it's musical quality. I pray tonight the starry light might surround you, and then the final line, and then the rhyme pattern's very original too. Tonight light might, and then we have surround you, confound you, astound you, linking the three stanzas. I think this is very well crafted.
Right. And I mean, at the end, he kind of, I pray ere tomorrow an end to your sorrow. May angels white chorals sing and astound you. I mean, there's a very, the reading of something like this, it's a musical question, I feel. You know what I mean? If we're going to think about, well, how are we supposed to read this? It's really a question of delivery and making sure, like, all the tension and the potential that's being built up, it's sort of released and astound you, right? When one has to find a way to sort of release that poetic tension. And he gives us this beautiful line to do that, and astound you, astound. That has a very nice sort of round, it's a roundness to the sound, which is sort of, it's very satisfying.
Well, chorales is also that's the only line that doesn't rhyme in this. And that's sort of the point to which it's the tension point. The whole poem builds to that. The angels white chorales sing, and then astound you is sort of a denouement to the end.
Right. And you said it has this ethereal quality. It has a je ne sais quoi, we would say here in Montreal as French speakers. So okay, here's something else. Now it's going to get a bit more intense. I mean, this is a different kind of energy, and so I feel like we can read. Okay, these three poems in themselves will make for an interesting experience because they all touch on the same kind of idea, but in their own particular way. And so when taken all together, there's like this nuanced treatment that, you know, each one sort of brings to add to an overall general poetic sense. So the first one is Ebb Tide. Massive gray, these leaden waves bear their unchanging burden, the sameness of each day to day, while the wind seems to struggle to say something half submerged planks at the mouth of the bay might nuzzle limp seaweed to understand. Now collapsing dull waves drain away from the unenticing land, shrieking gulls shadow fish through salt spray, whitest streaks on a fogged silver mirror. Sizzling lightning impresses its brand. Unseen fingers scribble something in the wet sand. So that's Ebb Tide. I mean, very impressive. Just that, again, just a few lines, and it's really there's a lot of tension there. This next one's called Infinity. So I believe this is another one of Burch's earlier poems, and I mean, I think, yeah, it'll just come through. Infinity. Have you tasted the bitterness of tears of despair? Have you watched the sun sink through such pale, balmless air that your soul sought its shell like a crab on a beach, then scuttled inside to be safe, out of reach? Might I lift you tonight from earth's wreckage and damage, on these waves gently rising to pay the moon homage? Or better, perhaps let me say that I too have dreamed of infinity, windswept and blue. So that's Infinity, just two stanzas. I mean, he's really this is home run after home run. Sunset, third one. This was written for his grandfather. Between the prophecies of morning and twilight's revelations of wonder, the sky is ripped asunder. The moon lurks in the clouds, waiting as if to plunder the dusk of its lilac iridescence. And in the bright, tentacled sunset, we imagine a presence full of the fury of lost innocence. What we find within strange whirls of drifting flame, brief patterns mauling winds to form and maim, we recognize at once, but cannot name. So, yeah, I feel like there's a common theme here. I mean, this is a common theme in Burch's poetry. I think it's a timeless theme, and he does it so beautifully. I mean, these are all perfect poems. These are, I mean, this is what timeless poetry looks like, and these were all written in the 20th century, and yet this is not. These need to be household poems. I mean, this should be read by everybody, right, in a literature class today, so that they can see how everything that we're talking about in terms of classic poetry, timeless poetry, what it could look like today. You know, it's not just something of the past.
I don't know what I could add to that.
What do you think about these poems? What do you like about these poems? I'm sure you like them.
The language is spectacular. I think the most technically well crafted is Infinity, actually. But there's some lines that just jump out, and sizzling lightning impresses its brand.
Unseen fingers scribble something in the wet sand.
The moon lurks in the clouds, waiting as if to plunder the dusk of its lilac iridescence. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
you can't come up with that.
This is Shakespearean. This is Shakespearean. I mean, it's got that same quality, right? To be quite frank, like, I mean, this is as nice as you could say these things. You know what I mean? He's sort of perfected his use of language, to a poetic effect. He's sort of perfected it. So there's so much to learn here, and the fact that there's such ease to these poems, right? And it's not like any of them are that lengthy, but yet they're so dense. and there's such a gripping idea. I mean, there's just so much to appreciate. Let's change tone. Okay, we're about to get a bit more epic here. So we've heard. I mean, how would you define Mike Burch's poetry up until now? What we've read. What is your general impression, if you had to give a general impression about this poet up until
I
now?
would say lush, ethereal, um, gorgeous. If I
Right,
had to pick three adjectives.
right. I mean, it's almost yeah. I mean, it's I think if you look at Poe, if one reads the way that Edgar Allan Poe talks about poetry, you know, you say ethereal, gorgeous, and there's, especially with the last three poems we talked about, there's a longing, right? There's a sort of reaching for something in the distance, as Poe calls it, and he calls it a thirst for immortality. And I think people today, I mean, I feel like the culture is a bit more cynical today. So the idea that human beings thirst for immortality, that kind of sounds like some sort of just a literary trope or something. But the point is that human beings are not just flesh, right? There's something immaterial about human beings. There's something, you could call it spiritual. I mean, people can call it what they want. But the point is that there's a material aspect and there's an immaterial aspect. And Burch is really able to tap into both. And that's why I think these poems work. He's able to stir that deeper thing within us and make us conscious of it, so that we now sort of become aware, and ultimately it increases our own sensibility towards the poetic, right? Towards things that are more nuanced, more complex, and that speak to something that is not material in human nature, but which can yet be defined, as Burch is doing here, and investigated. The only difference is that the language is different. It's not literal language, which is, I think, the big issue, right? Poetic language is not literal language, it's metaphorical. The reason it's not literal language is because the nature of the subject it's dealing with cannot be defined in literal terms. But just because it can't be defined in literal terms, it doesn't mean that it can't be defined in non-literal terms. And how one does that? Well, I mean, that's the magic of poetry. That's why we need poets. That's what it means to be a great artist, to be able to find a way to do that. So, I mean, we could go on. There's plenty to say, but to change the voice a bit and the tone, here's something which I think is really Shakespearean, and yet it's totally modern. I mean, you could read this kind of poem in any age. It's called To Have Loved. So get ready for this, everybody. Helen, bright accompaniment, accoutrement of war, as sure as all the polished swords of princes, groomed to lie in mausoleums all eternity. The price of love is not so high as never to have loved once in the dark, beyond foreseeing. Now, as dawn gleams pale upon small wind-fanned waves, amid white sails, now all that war entails becomes as small as though receding. Paris in your arms was never yours, nor were you his at all. And should God's call in numberless strange voices, should you hear, still what would be the difference? Men must die to be remembered. Fame, the shrillest cry, leaves all the world dismembered. Hold him, lie, tell many pleasant tales of lips and thighs. Enthrall him with your sweetness, till the pall and ash lie cold upon him. Is this all? You saw fear in his eyes, and now they dim with fear's remembrance. Love, the fiercest cry, becomes gasped sighs in his once gallant hymn of dreamed salvation. Still, you do not care, because you have this moment, and no man can touch you as he can. And when he's gone, there will be other men to look upon your beauty, and have done. Smile, woe begone, pale, haggard. Will the tales paint this, your final portrait? Can the stars find any strange alignments, zodiacs, to spell or unspell what held beauty lacks? Wow. I mean, how's that for a poem? Who wrote this? You know what I mean? Who wrote this? Where is this from? Where is this coming from? Where has this poet been? Why did I not hear about this before? Before I started surfing the internet. Um, I mean,
Well, I mean, we could go into a whole long discourse about the place of poetry in society today and why it's been relegated, and
yeah.
um, but again, we
The
we we
question
don't
is the
have all
theme.
night.
The question is the theme, right? I think that's maybe one way we can just sort of ground discussion of a poem like this, right? Because it's very lofty. It's a bit longer, but he's treating the question of, this is a theme. This is Homeric, right? He's taking a Homeric theme, Helen, Paris, kidnapping Helen, and he's talking about it. He's speaking to Helen.
I was going to say, this is a very, yes, it has an epic subject, but it's very intimate in its tone. It's just the narrative voice speaking to Helen and appealing to her inward feelings. And one gets the impression, at least, that it's just the two of them, the narrative voice and Helen, or maybe it's even um, the narrative voice isn't a physical person. It's Helen speaking to herself. But whichever it is, it's very intimate. It's dealing with the inmost feelings
Right,
of the subject. Even though this is, from the Iliad, and the face that launched 1,000 ships and all of that.
right. I mean, at the most surface level of commentary, I'd say this is a very original treatment of a timeless theme. I mean, there's a million different ways to treat a theme, like the sack of Troy, Helen, Paris. I mean, Shakespeare. This is probably good material for another podcast, but if one compares, it's very interesting to compare Shakespeare's treatment of the story of Troy to Homer's. There's a difference here. Shakespeare takes it up in Troilus and Cressid, and it's fascinating. It's one of my favorite plays, and part of the reason I really like it is there's a lot of long sort of orations and speeches, and there's a lot of sophistry. One person arguing for the war, and the other person chiming in, and the other person making appeal to the gods, whether they're rational or not. Do they yield to rational, requests or not? And so there's this question of, are the gods reasonable? And this is all in Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressid. It's beautifully done. So I mean, if we look at the common treatments, I mean, there's the Aeneid, there's Homer's Iliads and Odyssey, and there's Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressid. And I mean, I like to think of this poem within that continuity, and I think it does something original, beautiful, and gripping. I can see this recited on a stage. It's very dramatic. It's very, like you said, it's very intimate, yet it's very dramatic, and those go very well together.
And that speaks to what we were talking about earlier about tradition. This is definitely within the canonical tradition of the Iliad mythos and of Greek mythology in general. Yet it's new, and it's modern, and it carries through that tradition to our present and speaks to us using it in terms we can understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's gorgeous. It's as you said, it's gorgeous. It's perfect. So, I mean, this is going to be the last Birch poem that we read for tonight. And I mean, having read these, I feel Birch has so many great poems that it actually was. This isn't just something nice that I'm saying because we know we're supposed to say nice things. but he has so many great poems, and they all read so beautifully. You know that I mean, Burch's poetry really makes for a wonderful night of poetry. That I mean, should be something that should be happening in households across America, across Canada, across the English-speaking world. And I think that's one of the things we're passionate about at the Chain Muse and New Lyre, is bringing the recitation of poetry, the classical recitation, the art of classical recitation of poetry back to life, taking the poems off the page, and none of this spoken word stuff. I mean, this is different. This is not spoken word. I mean, people may feel differently about these things, but this is not spoken word. That's not how these poems work. And I think that we can just leave it at that, and people can just deal with that if they're not sure what it means. But this is not spoken word. That's not how these poems work. So I would like to read In the Whispering Night, which I mean, it's one of my favorite Burch poems, just because I think it's a perfect poem in terms of theme, treatment, form, everything. And it was written for George King, who was Burch's literary English literature teacher, I believe, or poetry teacher when he was in college. So when he was a young man. And I mean, he has some funny stories about that. But he dedicated this poem, In the Whispering Night, for George King. So, and it's published in his book, Songs of Innocence, which we will be linking to, so people can actually get a hold of Mike Burch's poetry in a printed format, right? Which is, I think, the best way for poetry. I mean, I don't mind reading other things on the internet, but I like the idea of being able to carry around a book of poems or have it by my bed without the blue light glaring in my eyes. You know, that's it's never a bad thing. So, In the Whispering Night. In the whispering night, when the stars bend low till the hills ignite to a shining flame, when a shower of meteors streaks the sky and the lilies sigh in their beds for shame, we must steel our souls as they once were stolen, and gather our vigor and all our intent. We must heave our bodies to some violent ocean and laugh as they shatter and never repent. We must dance in the darkness as stars dance before us. Soar, soar through the night on a butterfly's breeze, blown high, upward yearning, twin spirits returning to the world of resplendence from which they were seized. Wow. I mean, that's a poem right there. In the Whispering Night. I mean, it seems like he doesn't get tired of writing timeless poems. Burch is, Burch is a modern timeless poem machine. If I had to sum up his work, I mean, this is beautiful. This is gorgeous. This is perfect. This is ethereal. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, you just about said it. We I think every single one of these poems had an ethereal quality to it. Even the epic "To Have Loved." I don't.
It's beyond words, which is what many of his poems are about.
Well, yeah, it's very well crafted. The lilies sigh in their beds for shame. Shower of meteors streaks the sky. Soar, soar through the night on a butterfly's breeze. The world of resplendence from which we were seized. It's
Right.
There's a way with words there that you don't find too much at any time.
Well, I mean, okay, I think it's almost too easy to almost dismiss this poem as perfect. I mean, it's just so perfect that it becomes easy to sort of just be like, oh, well, it's just a great poem. You know what I mean? Like it's just magic. And we sort of leave it at that. But there's one great irony here, which I mean is ultimately why the poem works. And I think that is the kind of spirit that Burch was tapping into, because he says, twin spirits returning to the world of resplendence from which we were seized. So they're going back to something. So, it's like we're on Earth, but just because we're on Earth and we were born on Earth, that doesn't mean that there's something beyond Earth, beyond the earthly, which is within us. And so here he's stating it as, now we're going back to the thing that we really were, from which we were seized. So Earth just becomes this sort of temporal sojourn in an otherwise sort of, you could simultaneity of eternity in sort of an eternal world of just of beauty and truth, which we on Earth only get glimpses of. I mean, this is how Poe talks about poetry. And I feel like this Edgar Allan Poe, if we read the way he talks about poetry, and if we read a lot of his poems, especially a lot of the earlier ones, I see a very special kinship between Mr. Burch and Edgar Allan Poe's poetry. It has that, you said ethereal, that's the word that's going to keep coming up, but it's because there's something beyond the material, beyond the flesh, and it just keeps coming back. Burch just keeps going for it, and here it's just beautifully sort of framed, as in that thing is what we're now sort of reuniting with, that we were torn apart from and sort of had to just experience from a distance, right? So it's beautiful. This is from Songs of Innocence. So there's so much that could be said, but we wanted to take the time to look at a few Burch poems. It's difficult to read and then dissect poems. Any way you approach that, it comes with its own set of challenges. Now, the question, Adam, is, do we want to give our listeners a bit of a bonus? We've covered Burch's poetry, but there's another poet who I think also captures and taps into the kind of magic that Burch taps into. And he's another 20th, 21st century poet, we can call him, Jared Carter, who is actually from the same area you're from.
Yes, he's a fellow Hoosier.
He's a what?
A fellow Hoosier. People from Indiana, we're not called Indianans, we're called Hoosiers.
Oh, how about that? Okay. So, yeah, do we want to give, we can call this, how long have we been going on for now?
Almost an hour and a half.
Okay, so.
Why don't we do one of his?
Okay.
I'll let you pick.
Yeah, we'll do After the Rain.
Okay.
And this will maybe just set up, we're gonna do a podcast. We're gonna get more in depth into more. Okay, let's put it this way. We're gonna do another podcast, which is gonna be dedicated to, since we've kind of we've gone on for a while now. I didn't see the time goes by. Good poetry has that effect, right? We'll do another podcast on the poetry of Kevin Roberts, who's another mind-blowingly good poet. He's amazing. It's fantastic, and he actually passed away in, I believe it was 2008. And I think a lot of the world still needs to discover his poetry. So we're going to be talking about the poetry of Kevin Roberts, and we're going to be talking about the poetry of Jared Carter. So this can be a sort of
teaser.
Pardon me?
A teaser.
Yeah, this will be a teaser. So this is going to be a good teaser. You've been warned. So this is called After the Rain by Jared Carter. So I just want to make sure I got this in front of me properly. After the rain, it's time to walk the field again, near where the river bends. Each year I come to look for what this place will yield. Lost things still rising here. The farmer's plow turns over without fail, a crop of arrowheads. But where or why they fall is hard to say. They seem like hail dropped from an empty sky. Yet for an hour or two after the rain has washed away the dusty afterbirth of their return, a few will show up plain on the reopened earth. Still, even these are hard to see. At first they look like any other stone. The trick to finding them is not to be too sure about what's known. Conviction's liable to say straight off, this one's a leaf or that one's merely clay, and miss the point. After the rain, soft furrows show one way across the field, but what is hidden here requires a different view. The glance of one not looking straight ahead, who in the clear light of the morning sun simply keeps wandering across the rows, letting his own perspective change. After the rain, perhaps, something will show, glittering and strange. So, this is an amazing poem. I love this poem for many different reasons. And I mean, it's just more proof that there are timeless poets out there.
Well, and this is a completely different style from Burch. This is not ethereal at all. This is a very down to earth, conversational, very concrete voice. We don't have the what was it? Of course, I closed it out. The dusk of the iridescent moon, or whatever it is. We don't have those effusions like we did with Burch. Here we have, the farmer's plow turns over without fail, and I can say that because I'm just picturing a downstate, farmer saying this sort of thing.
Right.
Very, very matter of fact. Yet it's still poetic, and that's what I think is the real. Both of these, both Burch and Carter, they write in rhyme and they use meter, but here we have two completely different voices. It's uniquely them, and that shines through.
Yes, and I mean, that's actually what I love, is to, when you discover a new poet, right, a real poet, and you get to discover that they have their own unique voice, and you start to get familiar with that unique voice, and you see that same voice come up in different poems, right? And then you see that each poet has their own unique voice. It's really amazing. And I mean, I think it's important because, like you said, these kinds of poems are so different, and yet they're all original, and they all sort of appeal. They all appeal to this timeless standard, right? There's something timeless about, we don't need a some sort of prescriptive or formal definition to be able to say this, but they all appeal to a certain kind of timeless quality. And I think the more people are exposed to that, right, and that we sort of can select some of the best examples of that as models, as the kind of thing that people can sort of look to get a sense of, well, what does timelessness look like in the 21st century? Well, here you have it in Mike Burch and Jared Carter. So,
and I couldn't have said that better myself. And I think that's a good segue into our next podcast on this subject.
Yeah. So this was just a teaser of a lot more. I mean, this was just a teaser of Carter's poetry. I hope all our listeners enjoyed the poetry readings. I mean, we do our best. We want to have other people reading too. And yeah, we're going to be coming back with a lot more. We're going to be featuring more timeless 20th and 21st century poets. And we're hopefully going to be inspiring new timeless 21st century poets. And I think that's the most exciting part. So, I mean, thank you for joining us, Adam.
Thank you for having me again.
We have no shortage of subjects and things to talk about, but we'll have to end it here for tonight. So I thank you everybody for listening, and we'll be back with everybody next week to talk more about timeless poetry. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.